The 2010-12 Algerian protests was a series of protests taking place throughout Algeria, lasting from the 28th of December 2010 to early 2012. The protests had been inspired by similar protests across the Middle East and North Africa. Causes cited by the protesters included unemployment, the lack of housing, food price inflation, corruption, restrictions on freedom of speech and poor living conditions. While localized protests were already commonplace over previous years, extending into December 2010, an unprecedented wave of simultaneous protests and riots, sparked by sudden rises in staple food prices, erupted all over the country starting in January 2011. These were quelled by government measures to lower food prices, but were followed by a wave of self-immolations, most of them in front of government buildings. Opposition parties, unions, and human rights organizations then began to hold weekly demonstrations, despite these being illegal without government permission under the ongoing state of emergency. The government suppressed these demonstrations as far as possible, but in late February yielded to pressure and lifted the state of emergency. Meanwhile, protests by unemployed youth, typically citing unemployment, hogra, oppression, and infrastructure problems, resumed, occurring almost daily in towns scattered all over the country. After the riots of 1988, the Algerian government had moved towards democracy, holding free elections. However, when the Islamic Salvation Front, FIS, won the first free parliamentary election in 1991, the military staged a coup d'état, voided the election results, declared a state of emergency which remained in force until 2011, and arrested the FIS leadership. This led to the founding of the armed Islamic groups, JIA, and the 10-year Algerian civil war, in which an estimated 250,000 people were killed. With the unchallenged election of Abdelaziz Bouteflika as president in 1999, civilian government was nominally restored. Violence died down as both guerrillas and soldiers were given immunity for their previous acts under the controversial Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation. Towards the end of his second term, Bouteflika amended the constitution to allow himself to run for a third term in 2009. To no one's surprise, he won the ensuing election, with, according to the opposition and the U.S. Embassy, a very low turnout. 70% of Algeria's population is less than 30 years old. Consequent high levels of youth unemployment, coupled with corruption and widespread poverty, are seen as reasons for dissatisfaction. The leader of the Rally for Culture and Democracy, said Saidi, claimed that during 2010, there were 9,700 riots and unrests in Algeria. Some protests were about issues such as education and health care, as well as rampant corruption. Prior to the outbreak of protests, in February 2008, United States Ambassador Robert Ford in leaked diplomatic cables called Algeria an unhappy country, stating there is much discussion among political circles about the constitution, the third term and the succession issue, but precious little discussion about how to address long-standing political alienation and social discontent throughout the country. He claimed there were strikes over food by different labor groups almost weekly and that almost daily there are isolated demonstrations with the occasional government office in some distant town attacked. Ford stated that voter turnout for the 2007 legislative and local elections was lower than ever before because Algeria's young people do not see the political system as having any relevance to addressing their problem. United States diplomats also claimed that the Algerian regime is more corrupt than the international community realizes and is also more fragile. The diplomatic cable also said that Bouteflika may have cancer. On the 29th of December 2010, clashes with police were reported in Algiers during protests about the lack of housing. At least 53 people were reported to have been injured and another 29 were arrested. In 2011, prices of basic foodstuffs rose significantly in Algeria, in line with global trends but also reflecting newly imposed regulations. Unprecedented protests in neighboring Tunisia over unemployment were already being reported, contributing to the mood. Between 3 and 10 January, riots and protests broke out across most Algerian towns, triggered by large increases in the prices of basic foods including oil, sugar, and flour. While localized riots have been a frequent occurrence in Algeria since 2005, this set of riots was the first to spread across most regions of the country simultaneously rather than being confined to a particular area. By the 10th of January they were limited to a few towns, but continued in those towns. More organized efforts to demonstrate on the 11th of January in Algiers were suppressed vigorously by the police. Protests against the price increases started on the 3rd of January, with protest in the Ras El Ain quarter of Oran, and in Fouca and Stali near Algiers. On the 4th of January they were repeated in Stali and spread to other areas near the capital, with impromptu roadblocks at Douaouda in Tipaza and Koli. On the 5th of January, major riots broke out in several areas at once, in the Bab el-Oud neighborhood of the capital, Algiers, and nearby suburbs, as well as Algeria's second city, Oran, and other towns including Jelfa, Boumerdes, Annaba, and Tipaza. The young men rioting blocked roads, burned tires, and sacked government buildings, protesting the sudden increase in the cost of living, the demolition of shantytowns, and broader issues such as unemployment. They were met by anti-riot forces, who attempted to disperse the crowds. In Bab el-Oud, shops and car showrooms were also targeted. Former Islamic Salvation Front No. 2 Ali Belhaj went to Bab el-Oud to see the events and encourage the youths. He was arrested later that day, as were many other protesters and rioters. Within days the riots spread to 20-odd wilayas, covering almost the whole of the north including the Kabylie region, as well as some towns in the Sahara, such as Ouagla and Beka. Government buildings, particularly town halls, were widely targeted, and shops in some areas were looted or burned. Some other looters carried swords. Football matches scheduled for 7 and the 8th of January were cancelled. On the 8th of January, the government agreed to a temporary cut in taxes and duties on sugar and cooking oil. Facebook and Twitter access were also restricted in some areas. The rioting continued, at least up to the 10th of January in some places, such as the Bakjara neighborhood in Algiers. By the 11th of January, the situation had calmed. An attempt to demonstrate on the 11th of January in Algiers, organized in advance by the Intercommunal Committee of Ain Banyan and Stali, was repressed vigorously by the police. In total, 3 demonstrators died, more than 800 people had been wounded, and at least 1,100 were arrested, many of them minors. While riots on this scale are unprecedented since the 1991 election, their wider political implications are not yet clear. The rioters had no collective ties to any Algerian political party, organization, or trade union, and some sources commented that they seemed to have no political slogans. Some opposition groups emphasized the riots' political dimension. Ex-diplomat and opposition spokesperson Mohamed Labi Zitout described them as a revolt, and probably a revolution, of an oppressed people, while the Socialist Forces Front responded to the government's lowering of food prices on the 8th of January with the slogan "The government cannot buy Algerian silence." Agence France Presse, AFP, has linked the January protests with events in Tunisia, stating, "In Tunisia, similar unrest sparked the overthrow of the government of Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali, whose 23 years in power ended with his flight to Saudi Arabia last Friday." Algerian commentators have said that more Tunisia-style protests could break out in Algeria. Despite their scale, the riots were dealt with by the government in much the same way as the localized riots that had already become a routine way of communicating grievances. It sought to avoid creating martyrs and made a specific concession, in this case, a return to the status quo ante of allowing undeclared food sales by Civital, not seen as threatening the overall system. As the widely reported protests sparked off by Mohamed Bouaziz's self-immolation in Tunisia began to have a clear impact on the Tunisian government, a wave of self-immolations swept Algeria. These individual acts of protest mostly took place in front of a government building following an unsuccessful approach to the authorities. 4 self-immolators have died of their burns so far. It began on the 12th of January. When 26-year-old Mohamed Ouachia set himself on fire in Bourg-Menil in a compound of the Dera building. He had been sharing a room of 30 square meters with 7 other people, including his sister. Since 2003, he had repeatedly approached local authorities to get on the social housing list and been rebuffed. He has so far survived. On the 13th of January, Mohsen Bouteflika, a 37-year-old father of 2, set himself on fire. He had gone with about 20 other youths to protest in front of the town hall of Boukhadra in Tebessa demanding jobs and houses, after the mayor refused to receive them. According to one testimony, the mayor shouted to them, "If you have courage, do like Bouazizi did, set yourself on fire." His death was reported on the 16th of January, and about 100 youths protested his death, causing the provincial governor to sack the mayor. However, hospital staff the following day claimed he was still alive, though in critical condition. Al Jazeera described the suicide as echoing the self-immolation that triggered the protests that toppled the leader of neighboring Tunisia. He finally died on the 24th of January at a hospital in Annaba. These suicides were followed by dozens more attempted or successful self-immolations across the country, so far without triggering nationwide demonstrations, most of them after the Tunisian dictator Zine El Abidine Ben Ali fled his country on the 14th of January. A number of left-wing opposition parties, including the FFS, RCD, BLJ, and the Communist MDS, as well as the Algerian League for Human Rights, LAD, and officially unrecognized unions, such as SATEF and SNAPAP, met on the 20th of January to discuss responses to the situation. On the 21st of January, several of them, excluding the FFS, formed the Coordination Nationale pour le Changement et la Démocratie, National Coordination for Change and Democracy, seeking systemic change within the country and calling, along with Rachad, for nationwide marches, starting the 9th of February. 50. The Interior Minister, Ould Kablia, responded that no march would be authorized by the authorities in Algiers. Marches are forbidden in Algiers. Meanwhile, the mainly Kabyle-based secularist RCD party had announced plans for a March for Democracy to be held on Saturday the 22nd of January, despite being refused permission by the government under the state of emergency. Prior to the march, RCD leader said Saidi linked the planned march to the 2010 to 2011 Tunisian protests, stating, "If the opposition does not mobilize the crowds, we believe that we will have more devastating events than what happened in Tunisia. The anger here is bigger than it was in Tunisia." He also called for the 1992 state of emergency to be lifted and for the army to withdraw from politics, stating, "The army should no longer be a decision-maker, it has to become a state institution." The march attracted about 300 people, and was broken up by the police. 42 people, according to the RCD, or 19, according to the Interior Ministry, were injured, and 9, including the head of the party's parliamentary group Othman Ahmaz, were arrested, to be released later the same day. Some demonstrators waved the Tunisian flag, alluding to the protests which had brought down Ben Ali. Would-be demonstrators coming from Tizi Ouzou were prevented from reaching the scene by the police. On 22nd of January, 20,000 police officers stopped all protests. In the ensuing clash 5 people were killed and more than 800 others hurt. On the 23rd of January, the FFS and LAD jointly issued a demand for the release of the demonstrators arrested in early January, in Tizi Ouzou and elsewhere. Students of Tizi Ouzou announced plans for a march on the 1st of February demanding their release and economic development for Kabylie. On the 29th of January, the RCD organized a march of over 10,000 people, according to the organizers, in the city of Béjaïa, to demand more freedom and democracy. Domestic. In reaction to the protests of early January, starting the 8th of January the government decreased the prices of essential foods. Over following weeks it increased wheat supplies. On the 3rd of February Bouteflika announced plans to lift the emergency law, which prohibits protests without a permit, and substitute for it new anti-terrorism laws, but said that protests would remain illegal in Algiers in any case for well-known reasons of public order. He also announced new measures to create jobs and that state-run television and radio should be open to all political parties. On the 14th of February, his foreign minister Murad Medsi repeated the promise to end the state of emergency law, saying it would happen by the end of the month. On the 22nd of February the cabinet voted to lift the emergency law. It also voted on a measure to alleviate unemployment. In efforts to discourage the protests organized by the CNCD, the authorities played up the role of the RCD, a mainly Kabyle party unpopular elsewhere in the country, within them. While this tactic had some success, it did not stop demonstrators from turning out in some non-Kabyle cities. International European Union, President of the European Parliament Jerzy Buzek said that he called upon the Algerian authorities to refrain from violence and respect their citizens' right to peaceful demonstration. Any and all demonstrators arrested should be released immediately. The continuing state of emergency is unjustifiable and clearly hampers Algeria's prospects for the fair, peaceful and sustainable development of the country. It is but a first step in responding to the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Algerian people, but even this step has yet to materialize. Opposition groups, civil society, and especially young people should have the right to freely express their criticism of the government. No government can ignore the call of its people. France, Foreign Ministry spokesman Bernard Vallaro said regarding the demonstrations that what is important in our eyes is that freedom of expression is respected and that the demonstrations are able to take place freely and without violence, and welcomed the planned end to the state of emergency. Germany, Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle said Germany was on the side of Democrats. The German government calls on the Algerian government to renounce all recourse to violence. These are demonstrators who want freedom, who are doing nothing more than exercising a human right, to know the right to defend with dignity their point of view. As Democrats we are on the side of Democrats. I have already said that about Tunisia and Egypt. I say it again now in allusion to other countries. United States, Department of State spokesman P.J. Crowley said that we note the ongoing protests in Algeria, and call for restraint on the part of the security services. In addition, we reaffirm our support for the universal rights of the Algerian people, including assembly and expression. These rights apply on the Internet. Moreover, these rights must be respected. We will continue to follow the situation closely in the days ahead. Other regional financial stock market indices fell on the 20th of February on concern of spreading instability. NGOs Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb voiced support for the demonstrators against both the Tunisian and Algerian governments in a video released on the 13th of January 2011. AQIM leader Abu Musab Abdel Wadud offered military aid and training to the demonstrators. Amnesty International issued a statement that read, "Algerians must be allowed to express themselves freely and hold peaceful protests in Algiers and elsewhere. We urge the Algerian authorities not to respond to these demands by using excessive force." On the 21st of January, the international group Anonymous declared a cyber war on the Algerian state on the grounds of censorship, following previous efforts in Tunisia. 148. The next day they brought down the pro-government RND party website, having previously brought down the sites of the Ministry of the Interior and the national TV station.
She was with you in Amy's voice commentary from the English section on the channel Life Worldly.